Thanks so much for the opportunity to give this talk. I'm not up here as the sole expert on this material. There are a number of women and men in this room, some of whom I've talked to today, and some of whom I've read their materials in times past, but that know this material even better than I do. And I even at one point asked, why would you want me? Invite one of these other people that knows this so well. And but they were gracious to allow me to continue to present this material. I do have a little particular slice of letters that I've been focused on in the last year, and I thought to share those with you tonight. We are celebrating a number of anniversaries here, so of course it's not only the 175th anniversary of the arrival of the Jesuits here, but of course the 151 years of MHS. I also noted that today is apparently it's the 210th anniversary of the arrival of Lewis and Clark back in St. Louis. 127 years ago today, the Nintendo Corporation was created. They apparently made a playing card game called Hanafuda. Don't know anything about that, not very popular. Good thing they went with Super Mario Brothers. It's also the 141st anniversary today of the first arrest of Billy the Kid. He was arrested for stealing clothes off a clothesline at somebody's house, and of course he went on to greater fame and infamy. It's also the 125th anniversary of the 50th anniversary celebration of the arrival of the Jesuits in Montana. And there was actually a celebration, quite a big one about this. And I just want to share with you the text of the article. Actually, it was an editorial in the page of the Anaconda Standard on October 1st of 1891. Bishop Brondell, who was the bishop of the diocese that time, gave a big speech and talked about the arrival of the Jesuits and told a long history of Montana, the Catholics in Montana, certainly. But anyway, I just want to read this to you. I apologize. There was a plan, I think, initially to have that showing on two screens for those over in the far corner. I apologize. It's harder to see, but I'll read this out loud here. It says, "When the history of this new state is written, the impartial author will not fail to record the noble work accomplished for civilization and Christianity under the most trying and often dangerous circumstances by the men whose names are used in the bishop's brief sketch this morning. To Bishop Brondell and his predecessors and co-workers in the cause of religion belongs not a little of the credit for the enviable rank taken by Montana in the union of great states. They preserved order at times when strife was imminent. They paved the way for peaceful settlement when war would have best suited the taste of the settler and the Indian alike. They established in the wilderness and on the barren mountainside schools and churches and laid the foundation for statehood. They erected the baptismal font in the teepee of the savage. They taught him the arts of peace and brought to him the blessings and the consolation of the Christian faith. Theirs was a noble work. Its impress, stamped upon the life of the new land, can never be effaced." Well, indeed, their stamp upon the land has been great. Here we are, 175 years after their arrival, still reflecting and thinking about its impact here in the Bitterroot Valley. Those Jesuits who came built the first church in this region. They learned the languages of the native people. They wrote letters, hundreds of letters, in fact. Between 1830 and 1870, I've got about 700 letters and counting. In fact, we're going to get going with number 1 here in a minute, and we'll be done with 700, somewhere right about 1 in the morning. So thanks for being here. But I want to share with you tonight just a few reflections. We won't go through all of these hundreds of letters, but a few reflections that are in these letters on Montana's people and its places. Of course, their first encounter with the people and the places were one of absolute wonder. But for a variety of reasons, all good things did quickly come to an end. And my lecture tonight is actually a story about just what changed for the Jesuits. What caused their initial enchantment to turn to disenchantment. So I want to start our story somewhere in the middle of things, in fact. On July 13, 1874, an inspector for the Commissioner for Indian Affairs traveled to the Flathead Agency, ostensibly to oversee the handover of the agency's leadership from a Major Daniel Shanahan to a certain Mr. Peter Whaley. But this inspector, a man named Joseph Bevier, had another motive for this visit, one that he did not disclose to anyone in Montana Territory. He had been directed by the Commissioner for Indian Affairs, the Honorable E.P. Smith, to determine to what extent the Jesuits at St. Ignatius Mission were frustrating the government's efforts at moving the Flathead Indians out of the Bitterroot Valley and onto the Jocko. The commissioner, Mr. Smith, was right to be interested in this. The very fact that there was a handover of the agency's leadership from Major Shanahan to Mr. Whaley at all was due to the expressed frustrations of the Jesuits with Mr. Shanahan. And Mr. Smith was surprised by just how much power these Jesuits seemed to have accrued. They seemed to be able to get one of his agents fired and one of their own choosing hired. He suspected this power may also be holding back the government's program with the Flathead Indians. The following, I want to show a little bit of his report here. The following are the relevant portions of a text from this government inspector's report, Mr. Bevier. He contrasts the beauty and richness of the Jocko Valley with the poverty of appearance and soil of the area around St. Ignatius Mission. That's really how the report starts. Of course, the Jesuits completely disagreed with him on this, and multiple letters were written to dispute that view. He also comments on the Indians at the Jocko Reservation. He contrasts the high quality of the agency's buildings against the lower quality facilities at the mission. Again, something the Jesuits strongly contested. But when he got to this section on the mission, the St. Ignatius Mission, it prompted him to remark on what he thinks about the Jesuits and their chosen agent, Mr. Whaley. And that's what's here on the board, on the screen, excuse me. It says, the new agent, that is Mr. Whaley, will be entirely subservient to the dictation and machinations of the priests. So he proposes now a way to get rid of him. Give their first allotment of money, annuities, and supplies to a good local man, such as Mr. Claggett, somebody he interviewed while he was here, who will then be instructed to tell the Flatheads in the Bitterroot Valley they have 3 months to leave and settle in the Jocko, or they'll be treated as citizens of the U.S. and not Indians. And then, as citizens, you give them no money or annuities, and instead tax and treat them as citizens. It'll take a few years, according to this inspector, but the work wanted to be done by the government will finally get done. It certainly won't get done by Mr. Whaley. So this July 1874 report reveals much, but the one thing that is most important for our purposes tonight is that the Jesuits had overstayed their welcome. They had been too successful in building their St. Ignatius Mission. That mission, along with their comparatively much smaller St. Mary's Mission at that time, was making it possible for the Flathead to continue to live in the Bitterroot Valley. Worse still, the Jesuits have now successfully installed a puppet regime of Mr. Whaley over this agency. The best thing the government could do at this point is to get rid of both of them, and that'll be done by withholding annuities from any who remain. And it is in fact quite something to read that the Jesuits were standing in the way of government achieving its objectives, because it marks quite a reversal of fortunes for the Jesuits from just a few years before that. 20 years earlier, the government was literally begging for the Jesuits' assistance to facilitate Governor Isaac Stevens' 1853 tour of the interior Indian tribes. Isaac Stevens wrote several letters to De Smet begging him to come along on the trip, and De Smet every time wisely passed. He could see where things were going. Again, in 1855, Father Hogan was called upon frequently at St. Ignatius Mission to assist Stevens again with completion of his Hellgate Treaty with the Confederated Tribes. And more than a decade before that, the Jesuits' arrival in the Bitterroot Valley was hailed by the Flathead people as an answer to their years-long prayers. So what changed for the Jesuits? How did they go from being hailed as long-answered prayers and gracious assistance to being men standing in the way of progress? Well, the Jesuits' letters themselves give us some insight into this process of transformation. So it will help to see something of what the earliest Jesuits thought about their first years in this land. I want to look at a few letters from the 1840s with one Jesuit writer in the 1880s called the Golden Age of the Jesuits' time in the Rocky Mountain missions. Of course, Pierre-Jean De Smet is the most widely known of correspondents during this period. His letters regarding the Rocky Mountain missions fill volumes in libraries. But that's to be expected of a Jesuit who took it upon himself to promote the work, to raise funds, to seek out workers for these mission fields. And his correspondence is awash in excitement about the people, the place, and the work in which the men were engaged. Consider his comments in two letters that he wrote to Father Verhagen, the Jesuit superior back in St. Louis, in the early 1840s. First of these letters is about the land. While traveling in early November across a particular mountain just beyond the Missoula Valley, he doesn't say which particular place he was, but he says he arrived at a peak, and after nearly dying, he says, but then he experienced this. There I breathed freely and contemplated the magnificent prospect that presented itself to my sight. The windings of the river with the scenery on its banks. On one side, hung over our heads, rocks, piled on rocks in the most precipitous manner, and on the other stood lofty peaks, crowned with snow and pine trees. Mountains of every shape and feature reared their towering forms before us. Concerning the people with whom he came to minister, the Flatheads, De Smet wrote in another letter to Father Verhagen, quote, I have spoken of the simplicity and the courage of the Flatheads. I shall make some other remarks concerning their character now. They little resemble the majority of the other Indians, who are, generally speaking, uncouth, importunate, improvident, and he goes on with a number of other descriptions. Flatheads are disinterested, generous, devoted to their brethren and friends, irreproachable, and even exemplary as regards probity and morality. With respect to religion, the Flatheads are distinguished by the firmness of their faith and the ardor of their zeal. And then he adds this line, their confidence in us is unlimited. It's this last statement of Father De Smet, their confidence in us is unlimited, that turned out to be rather premature. The Flatheads would, by the late 1840s, give less credence to the Jesuits and pay less heed to their instruction. Some scholars have even accused De Smet of knowingly misleading other Jesuits who were being recruited to come to the Rocky Mountain missions with false stories of just how receptive everybody would be here, and also of misleading donors, people who were giving money to help the Rocky Mountain missions. But Father De Smet was not the only Jesuit who came here, and so we do have evidence from other people, and Father Nicolas Point was one of those. He had his own views about the earliest days of the mission. Sorry, I'm going to go back in my slides because I just had one out of order, but this is a drawing Nicolas Point made in 1842 of St. Mary's Mission. Obviously just less than a year, really, of the progress since they've arrived. Where was it? Okay, good. Father Nicolas Point, he had his own views, right? And in one of the correspondences, he wrote about that day, September 24th, 1841. He was looking back on it. What did he experience when he entered the Bitterroot Valley for the first time? This is what Nicolas Point wrote about that experience. He says, we passed through the gorge, which has been called Hellgate. By the way, De Smet had to write a lengthy letter apologizing to his Jesuit superiors for using the term hell and multiple times, and devil, and all these other things. He goes, that's what the people here call all these rivers and places. But anyway, Nicholas doesn't go into that. But not finding here that which we were in search of, we went up again through a pass trending southward. It was quite narrow at first, but then constantly grew wider until we had marched a full day's journey. And suddenly, as we reached the foot of the highest mountain in these districts, talking about just outside of Stevensville, we were agreeably surprised at sight of the rich vegetation unfolded before us. 2 streams, the broad valley, defended against the rigors of northern winds by another chain of mountains covered at the base with forests. So you can see the beauty of the space, right? Just really inviting. Father Point's correspondence also reminds us of the fact that the Jesuits encountered more than just the Salish in their travels throughout the Rockies. Okay? In another one of his letters, he talks about his encounters with the Canadian trappers who were working with the Hudson Bay Company. In fact, he relates a story that in fact becomes an all too familiar experience for him. He's a French-speaking priest, Catholic priest, and he's encountering these French-speaking Canadian trappers here in Montana. And these were men that, although they were raised Catholic, had really wandered far from the church in their years away from home. Thankfully, to Nicholas, to Father Point's view, these men were happy to have him and his fellow Jesuits regularize their marriages with the native women that they had taken as wives. But they did have little use for their other religious services. Well, Father Point then wrote this about them. Many of them were well aware that they needed to be reconciled with more than one obligation, and all of them made fair promises to comply with their duty, but next year. He gets a little disappointed, he gets a little sad here at this next point. He says, for the greater number of them, however, next year was never to come. The third Jesuit priest to arrive with Father De Smet and with Nicolas Point was Father Gregory Mengerini. He was given charge, in fact, of St. Mary's Mission after Father De Smet left, and he remained there until it was closed in 1850. He probably had the most to say about this place and its people. And in looking over much of his correspondence, I think that if someone had told him Montana is the last best place, he might have hit you. He characterized the journey from Fort Hall to St. Mary's this way. If the road to the infernal regions were as uninviting as that to Hellgate, few, I think, would care to travel it. He complained that the land around St. Mary's was too dry and filled with too many rocks that frequently broke his plow. But most frequently in his letters, he complains about the cold. He wrote in his memoir that the winter freeze began by November 15th and it lasted until February 20th, and even sometimes at various points in March. He also wrote in another document, quote, let me move forward so you can see this. Oh, I did have that one. There we go. Now we're back on track. I scarcely dare attempt to describe the cold, for even now when I think of it, a chill comes over me. At night, we rolled ourselves in several blankets and then in a buffalo robe. Yet in the morning, we awoke to find robe and blankets frozen into one piece. We crept out of our frozen shell and set it before the fire to thaw, and this we did daily throughout the long months of winter. Mr. MacArthur, clerk of the Hudson Bay Company, explained to me that it was colder indoors than out. For, said he, outside a dew falls by night, and when the dew freezes, it forms a coat impervious to the cold. But nothing of the kind happens inside. Well, though not lacking confidence in his outdoor theory, I never cared to test it. Probably a good thing. Well, the comments of De Smet, Father Point, Father Mengerini are helpful, but so are the reflections of some of the second and third generation Jesuit arrivals, such as those by Father Louis-Marie Rouillon. He arrived in Montana by train in 1884, April of 1884. Okay, if anybody here from eastern half of Montana, you may want to cover your ears. You're not going to like what he has to say here. He found traveling through eastern Montana absolute tedium. He wrote this in a letter to a priest friend back in New Jersey. Quote, I don't have it. Yeah, there were woodlands and forests in the valley and alongside the banks of the beautiful river. But the fantastic-looking hills were naked of all verdure. Monotony, terrible monotony, is the ever-present feeling on experiences traveling along this route. For me, it was even more wearisome than the heavy tedium that comes from days spent on the watery plain that is the sea. Wow. Thankfully, western Montana proved far more interesting to Father Rouillon. Oh, okay. Something is out there of order. I apologize. Okay, well, you'll like this one. This is from his western Montana experience. Same train ride, letter to the same friend. On leaving Helena, I experience more weariness. But my heart was overflowing with poetry now. The train chugged along slowly up mountain passes and through gorges until it almost reached the very summit, and then it entered a long tunnel, the prelude of its descent. Although not very high, these are real mountains, beautiful, with numerous snow-covered peaks. There's forests of fir trees that clothe the slopes, cascading torrents, masses of sawtooth rock, and vertical cliffs. Occasionally, there was a lone frame house standing by the railroad line. Naturally, our long descent through magnificent valleys was made at a faster clip than our ascent, and at last we made our way out of these narrow, luxuriant valleys into a vast, rich plain, encircled by magnificent mountain ranges, flooded with the sun's light and warmed by its rays. It was the most beautiful sight I had seen since leaving St. Paul. A town is rising here. They call it Missoula, and the surrounding land seems rich indeed. So he had a good experience in that part of the train ride. After a few days of rest in Missoula, he got back on the train, just so you know, and he continued on to Spokane, which is where he would go meet Father Cataldo. And he then says, "It was so boring, I fell asleep." So apparently this is the best part for somebody from New Jersey. Father Ruellen would later conduct several journeys among the Rocky Mountain missions and occasionally stop at small towns along the route to see if there were any Catholics who would like his services in exchange for a night's sleep, a place to sleep. In a letter dated June 26 to Father Cataldo, he wrote of his overnight stop in Belknap, Montana. Anybody from Belknap or anywhere near there? Okay, well, might want to cover your ears here. Belknap is this is his description. Belknap is a town at the bottom of a narrow valley, consisting of some 20 to 30 cabins built among the pines. Nothing is wanting there except the good Lord. And indeed, there's no room for him there. Well, thankfully, De Smet's letters about his first years in Montana reached Father Ruellen before Mangiarini's letters did, because otherwise Father Ruellen never would have come. And many of the other Jesuits would not have come either, right? But I'd like to pivot now and talk about another series of letters. Well, I'm going to summarize them for the sake of time, but I want to talk about another series of things that happened between 1850 and 1870. The three original Jesuit priests had left Montana at this point. De Smet was now back in St. Louis, working for the Missouri province as its treasurer. Father Point, who had long struggled with mental illness, had retired to Montreal. And the closure of St. Mary's in 1850 was such a significant blow to Father Gregory Mangiarini that he asked to leave Montana, and he was never to return again. The Jesuits who came in their place had really decided to focus on new fields. The mission among the Blackfeet, which Nicolas Point had begun earlier, was growing. Work among the Nez Perce in Idaho was expanding, and new work was beginning among the Spokane and among tribes on the Colville Reservation. And California, too, was a promising new field. Simply put, the Jesuits were moving on from St. Mary's and from the Bitterroot. But appeals from Father Hocken and some Salish did not fall on deaf ears with the Jesuit superiors. They agreed in 1854 to open a new mission site for the Salish, but now with an eye towards a location a bit further away from where they were predicting white settlers would come. And so instead of settling in the Bitterroot Valley, they chose what is now the site for St. Ignatius Mission. It would be several years later, only after they realized the Hellgate Treaty was unsuccessful and the Flathead were refusing to depart the Bitterroot Valley, that the Jesuits decided once again to open St. Mary's Mission, which they did in 1866. But the glory days of the 1840s were gone. And listen to this, there's a descendant to Father Ravalli here. In February of 1876, Father Ravalli wrote to Montana's territorial representative in Congress, begging that someone help him secure the land rights to the 640 acres of St. Mary's Mission. No one at the Helena General Land Office was willing to help him stop the constant encroachments of white settlers who, he complains, kept trying to jump the mission's land. Father Ruellen, come back again to him, he was equally downcast about the white settlers in the region. He called them, quote, a cloud of locusts. They leave nothing but devastation in their wake. Because of them, he writes, quote, the woodlands disappear. The Indians are pushed back on their reservations, where they become totally miserable. And then he sort of waxes poetic here. He says, and the America of yesterday, the poetic, untamed America, is transformed into the America of today, the America of prose, pride, riches, moral degradation, and religious indifference, at least in all places where Catholicism has not prevailed. Well, during the 1850s and 1860s, the Jesuits found they had to balance too many competing interests. The Rocky Mountain missions had proven to be more difficult work than once thought. The Flathead people had grown lukewarm towards them. The white settlers distrusted them, and the government was growing increasingly hostile. To top it off, money and staffing for the missions was dropping precipitously. So this brings us back to where I started our presentation earlier tonight. The government's conclusion that the Jesuits in Montana, and at St. Ignatius Mission in particular, had become part of the problem and were no longer part of the solution. In fact, when you look at the Jesuit correspondence during those years, 1872 to 1874, it's not hard to see why the government might have thought this. Mr. Bevier's visit to Montana and to the Flathead Agency in July of 1874 was occasioned by that forced resignation of Major Shanahan as Indian agent. And it is kind of a fun story. There's about 100 or so letters for this story, but I'm not going to bore you with all of those details. But I just want to give you a brief summary. And what happened in 1870 is with President Grant's peace policy that the agency system was reorganized around the country. And religious denominations were assigned to each agency. And if you don't know that, if you didn't know, by historical right, the Catholic Church should have been given religious charge over both the Flathead and the Blackfeet. But President Grant was not disposed favorably to the Catholics, and there was a number of letters about this, but he ends up giving it to the Methodist Church, and that created all sorts of conflict. But because of this policy, where there's religious denominations now assigned to every Indian agency, this is nationwide, the Catholic Church's bishops around the country and the Jesuits, like those here in the Rocky Mountain area, realized they were at a distinct disadvantage if they weren't living in Washington, D.C., to present their case to the administration. So the Catholic Church created a new organization called the Catholic Commission for Indian Affairs. And what they did with this commission was they hired two people, and those two people were the official representatives, official liaisons between the Catholic Church's many bishops and many missionaries, including the Jesuits, and the Commissioner for Indian Affairs with the government. They hired two people to run this office. One was a priest who became a bishop, who had long experience working with Native Americans in Oregon Territory. His name was Jean Brouillet. And the other was a retired military general and lawyer, a man named Charles Ewing. And they hired him because he had a distinguished military career, and that brought the necessary connections to the Grant administration and to the War Department. Well, the creation of this Catholic Commission, under the direction of Ewing and Brouillet, meant that they were the new official liaison between the Jesuits and the Rocky Mountain missions and the federal government. Any problem the Jesuits had to go through this office. Well, early in 1873, the Jesuits had a problem. They had a problem with the Flathead agent, Major Shanahan. He had only been appointed in February of 1873, but it took him literally a few weeks to decide he was going to get rid of the Jesuits. He didn't like them. He decided he would hand the agency over to a Methodist, which he was not supposed to do officially, but he decided to do it unofficially. So within weeks of arriving, he went and met a local Methodist minister, and Major Shanahan supposedly was Catholic. That's why he was chosen. He went to see a Methodist minister and said, I will allow you to build a church on the Jocko agency land, and then also you can build a school if you would like, and in fact I'll take the money from the Sisters of Charity. They get $2,000 a year. You can have that for your school. Well, Father Van Gorp, who was the superior, St. Ignatius Mission, he flipped a lid, to put it mildly. The Jesuits were furious, and they began a campaign to fire this new agent. But they didn't want to alarm Shanahan right away. He had only been in the job a few weeks. They didn't want to seem a bit too eager. So they secretly began a two-pronged campaign. The first prong of their campaign was the documentation of Shanahan's personal sins and professional misdeeds. By late summer of 1873, they are ready with their list. They forward their first list to General Ewing, and needless to say, he is shocked. He writes back to Father Van Gorp in October of 1873, and he says, you know, Shanahan is a pretty well-connected guy. That's why I gave him the job. You're going to need to send me proof of all of these charges. So Father Van Gorp and the other Jesuits set right to work collecting the necessary proofs. They begin to collect affidavits from individuals who witnessed all of these problems. A letter dated December 19th, 1873, from Father Van Gorp is sent to Bishop Brouillet at the Catholic Commission to document their material. And this letter, by the way, it's in the files of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions. It includes all the affidavits as well from all of these people. It says, so I'll just read it to you here, it's kind of small print, but it says, first, Major Shanahan has not proved himself honest in his dealings with the Indians. He has stealthily secreted and disposed of about $400 worth of blankets sent by the department as annuity goods for distribution among these Indians. Major Shanahan offered to sell these same blankets to a storekeeper at $7 a pair. I have this from the lips of the man to whom he offered to sell the blankets. Second, Mr. Shanahan has made himself famous in and around the agency as a gambler, so much so that the sheriff of the neighboring town of Missoula was called upon by one of the winners to make Shanahan pay $100, which he had lost and refused to pay. Now, one of the great evil habits of Indians is gambling. Their agent should certainly not set them the example. Thirdly, Mr. Shanahan has been guilty of drunkenness. It might be mentioned also that he kept in his employment as a doctor for the Indians a man who is, in the opinion of all those who know him, no better than a quack, and who besides manifests on every occasion his prejudice against the religious creed of these Indians. There are good doctors that are anxious to obtain this position. By the way, there are about 7 or 8 of these letters that are prepared and sent to Bishop Brouillet and General Ewing documenting Shanahan's problems. And in each case, they mark them as confidential. And in one of the letters, Father Van Gorp says, these are never to see the light of day. They are just for your use only, to fire Shanahan, right? Because he says, we Jesuits do not want to be brought into a court of law. So that's an interesting point, too. They were thinking far ahead about what would happen. Well, too bad. I've read them all. They weren't kept secret. And many others have read them. Anyway, the second prong of their campaign, so that was the first. What did they do next? They decided to start vetting new candidates for the position. Now, this part ended up backfiring on them because they thought they could keep their inquiry with potential candidates quiet. And I've heard this expression when I lived here, Montana's a big state, but it's just really one big small town, right? Everybody starts talking. The Jesuits had decided they wanted a judge and a member of Montana's territorial legislature from Gallatin County, a man named Owen Garrigan, to be the next agent. And they were pushing for him, starting in the summer of 1873. But within weeks of sending in their letter requesting that Mr. Garrigan be given the job, several others started sending applications into the Office of Indian Commissioner for the position, which they didn't know the position was even open. They got letters of application from a man named John Rainsford, another man named Patrick Quinn. They were both businessmen in Helena. They got an application from a deputy marshal in Deer Lodge named Mr. Glass. I didn't find out any more about him. He apparently tried to go and get Father Gorp to give him a letter saying he was a good Catholic, and Father Gorp said, see ya. And then he forged the letter. And Father Gorp found out about it and sent a letter saying, that's a forgery, and basically, I hope we never deal with him ever again here. And then a certain Mr. Peter Whaley from Meagher County applied, but actually it was his wife who filled out all the application material, and she ended up getting all his letters of recommendation for him. Not surprisingly, Major Shanahan hears about people applying for his job, and he's upset. So in November of 1873, he decides to visit D.C. to meet with both the Commissioner for Indian Affairs and with the Catholic Commission. Well, needless to say, that visit did not go well. The Commissioner for Indian Affairs thought he was doing a good job. Hey, you've only been in the job half a year, everything seems to be good. But the Catholic Commission was thoroughly unimpressed. And when push came to shove, this is what happened. Ewing called up the commissioner and said, as a general in the military, I ask you to let this major go. And he just pulled rank on the guy. And Shanahan was then forced to resign, write a letter of resignation for April 25th, 1874. The Jesuits' campaign was successful. They had won this battle. But as we find out, they ended up losing the overall war. The Commissioner for Indian Affairs did agree, out of deference to General Ewing, to let Shanahan go. But he also decided to dismiss any remaining respect he may have had for the Jesuits. And what was even worse, this is interesting, General Ewing even sends a letter months later to Father Van Gorp, suggesting he too was having skepticism about the motives of the Jesuits at St. Ignatius Mission. Well, throughout the dozens of letters that the Jesuits composed on this, two themes emerge that are important for our purposes here of identifying what the Jesuits taught. These non-Montanans, General Ewing, Bishop Rouillet, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, none of these people had ever visited this place. They didn't know anything about it. So they do tell us a few things about this place, and one of those they tell us is they stress just how anti-Catholic the people in Montana have become in the early 1870s. Father Palladino, writing in September of 1873 directly to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, complains that due to anti-Catholic sentiment by the former superintendent for Indian Affairs in Montana, a Mr. Weil, he was never paid a debt of over $1,000. That was a lot of money in that day, for supplies he gave to the Flathead Agency. Superintendent Weil had already run off two prior Catholic agents for the Flathead, one of whom, a man named C.S. Jones, wrote his own set of letters appealing his case to the commissioner. In November of 1873, Father Palladino also wrote to Bishop Rouillet at the Catholic Commission, exposing the anti-Catholicism of the supposed Catholic Major Shanahan, again, which led to all these trifles with the Jesuits. In March of 1874, Father Van Gorp, writing to General Ewing, explains that the clerk hired by Shanahan, too, has, quote, inaugurated a kind of persecution against the fathers and the mission. The letters also reveal another part of the Jesuits' difficulties in working with the federal government in Montana, and that was due to the heavy influence of Republican Party politics in D.C. and in this state, this territory. Not only were federal agents in Montana largely Protestant, and to them anti-Catholic, they were also of a different political party. Catholics in Montana in the early 1870s were almost entirely Democrats. Father Van Gorp felt that the Catholic Commission for Indian Affairs did not understand this. He felt obliged to stress this point repeatedly in the correspondence. For example, in a letter dated November 24th of 1874, Father Van Gorp writes, quote, "We never crave the honor of endorsing anyone for the position, but when called upon to do so," that's sort of a revision of history there. He wasn't called to make a change. He initiated the change. But anyway, "we have tried to do it conscientiously. We have made it our first object to try to find a Catholic Republican whose name we could endorse. But unfortunately, there are few Catholic Republicans in this territory. And among those few, we could find none whom we could consciously recommend. Not able to find a Catholic Republican, we thought it best to endorse one who had never taken any active part in politics." You remember they wanted that guy, Mr. Owen Garrigan? He was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. And General Ewing did put forward his name as the preferred agent for the Flathead based on the Jesuits' recommendation. He put forward it on April 16th of 1874. April 17th, the very next day, General Ewing got a letter back from the Commissioner for Indian Affairs, said, "We have found matters in his file that give us cause to want to decline to accept his name as nomination." They don't say it, but they're saying he's a Democrat, and that's not acceptable for this area. Let me conclude by just making a few remarks that summarizes this correspondence that we've talked about today. The Jesuits who arrived here in 1841 absolutely loved this place. Even in their dying days, Father Nicolas Point and Father Gregory Mengerini, who was out in California at that point in Santa Clara, they both wrote of weeping at the knowledge they would soon die without being able to return to Montana. That's really stunning considering some of the things Mengerini wrote when he was here. But the time has passed and he had fonder memories of the place. What was it about Montana that so transfixed the memories of Jesuits like Nicolas Point and Gregory Mengerini? What did they share with non-Montanans about Montana? Well, in terms of its people, they shared stories of respect for the Native Americans. They wanted non-Montanans to know the tribes, with the possible exception of the Blackfeet, were filled with men and women who sought to better their lives and to be instructed in the Christian faith. The white settlers, the Jesuits described them, as we said a moment ago, as degenerate locusts, constantly swarming about, staying only long enough to destroy the landscape and harm the people. The government agents, they fare little better in the Jesuit letters too. The Jesuits described them as too concerned about the needs of white settlers, too anti-Catholic, too Republican to be of much ultimate good to this region. What about the physical landscape? Well, this is where the Jesuits were always at a loss for words. They told non-Montanans that Montana's physical landscape was just simply breathtaking. It didn't matter if you were arriving in 1841 or 1891. The beauty of the Rocky Mountains and this Bitterroot Valley in particular would leave you speechless. Yes, the Jesuits complained about the long winter months. Yes, they complained about the cold lakes, the cold rivers, and the difficulty of travel in this region. But Jesuits like Mengerini could look back and remember with fondness his days, because he wrote in his final memoir that he would roam freely over the mountains when he was here. He could roam freely into the valleys and through the forests. All I needed in life was a decent tent, he wrote, a blanket, and a few food provisions, and I was free. Free to roam this largely human free space in the healthful mountain air. Well, I hope their appreciation for this place becomes something of ours as well. Thank you.